Hi, this is Paul. I've been doing a commentary series on the language of creation. And I took sort of a one video per chapter approach. The chapters are really small in part one. And then I hit part two. And I read chapter 5. And I really didn't get it. There weren't a lot of examples. But then I kept reading chapter 6, 7, and I went through the whole section, part 2. And I think really to get part 2, you should just keep reading and not so much worry about chapter 5 until after you've read chapter 13. Oh, see, now I've got a bunch of videos in the can, and I don't know. I can't refer to things that I've already said, and I have to make sure I send them out in the right order, and I don't know that I will, because I kind of want to put this one out today because of what's coming later. Anyway, you know how it is that you can't know a letter apart from a word, and you can't know a word apart from a phrase, and you can't know the phrase apart from a sentence, and you can't know the sentence apart from the paragraph or the meaning, and on out to the book. But you can't read a book all at once. You have to start with, you don't really read the words. You don't see the letters so much. You read the words. You sort of capture the words right away. And then they sort of roll into the sentence. And there's that kind of back and forth. And C.S. Lewis, this is the video that I'm talking about. C.S. Lewis talked about this in A Severe Mercy in his letter to Sheldon Van Auken, with respect to Sheldon Van Auken's question about Christianity. How can I understand Christianity unless and until I believe? And how can I believe Christianity unless and until I understand it? And Lewis makes the point that there's a lot of things in life like that, and this is one of them. And so I would say if you're reading this book, read part 2 in its entirety at one sitting. Again, it's not that long. It's only 21 pages, and it goes very, very quickly. And don't worry too much about not understanding 5 through 8 until after you've been through the examples, because the examples help make things clear. Now, I am going to spend a little bit of time on chapter 10, because as it turns out, this week is Transfiguration Sunday, at least in the Revised Common Lectionary that many of you work from. And there's a few of you out there like me who, some of you know, in the open studio, I I was watching Andrea and I can't think, and Cassidy's on Cassidy's channel talk about the open studio and how they do or don't like it and how it's weird, and it is weird, but I'm using it, and some of you are using it too. Where it'll go, how long it'll last, who of us knows, but it is kind of a way for me to kind of throw out a quick question sort of out there into a select sample of randomness in the universe. And a number of weeks ago, I asked people, where should I go in terms of basically how to span Epiphany and Lent? And some people would stick in the Revised Common Lectionary, which my buddy like Eric Dirksen, who always teases me on Twitter, does. Or should I, do a little book of the Bible? But it wasn't really a very long time. So someone on Twitter, a colleague of mine in Texas, said, try the narrative lectionary. And I've been doing that and sort of enjoying the way it does. It's sort of a happy medium in some ways, navigating this part of the year. Probably after we get through Easter and get back into common time, I'll probably do, I don't know what I'll do, but I've been enjoying the narrative lectionary. But anyway, we're coming to the end of Epiphany, and Epiphany climaxes at the Transfiguration, and the Revised Common Lectionary treats the Markan version of that, and the narrative lectionary treats the Lucan version of that. And that, for me, presents an issue, because I've been sticking to the lectionary more in the last few years. I approach these texts, and how do I want to treat the Transfiguration this year? Now, the Transfiguration goes like this. I'll read it to you out of the Lucan version. I'm going to be reading this out of the Lexham English Bible, which is a translation that's included with the Logos Bible software. And you can do a bunch of things to it. It's sort of a translation that in some ways still uses older forms of translation, sort of like the King James, but it isn't it's updated. There's a lot of nerdy reasons why I like to use this translations for Sunday school classes and for things like this. But it's a little bit different from the NIV or the English Standard Bible or et cetera, et cetera. Now, it happened that about 8 days after these words, Jesus had been talking. Jesus was revealing himself. He has that. He has the feeding of the 5,000, Peter's confession. You are the Christ, warns them that for the Son of Man will have to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and to be killed and raised on the third day. And he said to them all, if any of you would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross every day, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life on account of me, this person will save it. And then on to verse 28. Now it happened about 8 days after these words, he took along Peter and John and James, and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white, gleaming like lightning. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. And again, there's a lot going on here in terms of sometimes it's cross-textuality. We've got Moses in the scene, we've got Elijah, we've got the prophet stuff, and Exodus comes in here. Now Peter and those who were and those with him were very sleepy, and a bunch of this stuff. Luke's account, in fact, this account isn't in John, it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's quite different in all three, and that's really quite interesting. And in this account, Peter is mentioned. Peter, James, and John are there, but Peter is sleepy. And so, well, what did it happen at night? That's sort of in terms of a grammatical, historical approach to the Bible, that's a very natural question, because the kinds of clues you're looking for are historical, grammatical, physical clues. And this is part of Matthieu Pageau. I still can't say his name. So I'm going to try and say it fast. That's part of Pageau's point, that we're reading it with certain lenses on. And that's really a critical point to make in this, because then commentators, well, it happened at night. If they're making the point that it happened at night, the point of it isn't to give you the time of day. The Bible is not a clock, okay? I think the point is the drowsy, the sleeping, and then the revelation, all right? And that comes through. Luke makes that point. Mark and Matthew don't make that point. Now, Peter and those with him were very sleepy, and then they became fully awake. Now, again, I think the force of this is theological and symbolic. Now, Pageau would say spiritual, but again, as I've said many times in my commentary on this, if you say spiritual to a room full of evangelicals, I think just about anybody in our contemporary language group, that's going to take them in a certain direction, which isn't at all where Pageau wants them to go. All right. So, but we very much have sleepy and awake, and that's important here. They saw his glory and the 2 men who were standing with him. And it happened that and behold, I mean, all these translations have to manage this, the archaic language. What do these words mean? And it happened as they were going away from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not knowing what he was saying. And so they were fully awake, but he's incoherent. And while he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them. Now, this is a cloud. See, the reason I'm bringing this up is both because of light and heaven and earth, because all of those issues come to play strongly in this story. And we're going to get into a little bit of the history of this text. And this says, everything to do with Pageau's point for his book here. Because when someone in our century reads this text, they read it with certain filters. They read it about an event. Now, I've been listening to Tom Holland deal with the King Arthur narrative in his podcast, and we keep bumping into those same things. I had a appearance on a podcast yesterday, and I once again bumped into the question of, everyone is trying to place Jonathan Pageau in a framework within the modernist fundamentalist fight. And because of the way Jonathan sounds, people who come from sort of the fundamentalist branch listen to Jonathan and think, oh, he's more like a modernist. There's very little modernistic about Jonathan Pageau. In fact, that was the crying game moment with Rationality Rules. And the reason we keep bumping into this is, in a sense, and C.S. Lewis gets into this in his book Miracles, there are forks in history that we're trying to move past through, and we can't, because we can no longer recapture. This gets into very Barfieldian terms. We can no longer recapture mentally, culturally. We can no longer grasp, in terms of our exaptation, the original union and unity that has been split. And so I think that's the reason why Jonathan keeps being heard as a modernist. And I had this exact same thing when I first started listening to Jonathan Pageau, because I have these fixed categories and Pageau didn't fit into these categories. And so now, to the degree, and you know, Jonathan is trying to figure out how to talk about these things too. That's why he was talking to a number of the kinds of people he doesn't usually talk to. And it's really hard to explain himself. And it has everything to do with these issues in church history. So, back to the story. And while he was saying these things, now if you're watching the video and you see the italicized words in the LEB, this is why I say it sort of follows more of an archaic translation practice, because they will put in italics the words that the translation is adding. And so it's trying to render in some ways, and you can't really do this, to some degree, the word order and a word-for-word translation of the New Testament Greek. And while he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid. And again, the point here isn't simply to tell us what Peter was feeling. It's making theological points with that. But because of all of the forks between us and then, it's hard for us to see that. And so we sort of read it as if it's an expressive individualist text, and I just want to know what Peter is feeling. The text isn't terribly concerned about Peter's feelings. The text is concerned about communicating something that it's using language that's very difficult for us to understand and decode and connect with and live inside of. And a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And after the voice had occurred, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. There's so much here, and I'm going to probably post this afternoon, because I have to do this all over again tomorrow in my rough draft for Sunday, because I'm trying to figure out how to treat this text, because, you know, my last 3 years, I can't go back and treat these texts like I did before. I see too much. But my congregation has and hasn't been on this journey with me. And most people will read this passage and say, what am I supposed to get out of this? Okay, Jesus is God. Okay, yeah, that's what it's saying. But it's saying it in a way that communicated to most of the history of the text fairly directly that we don't connect very well with it anymore. And I'm going to demonstrate that. Okay, the portion on the right there is from ISBE, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. The Lord's appearance in glory during his earthly ministry is described only in the Synoptics, although 2 Peter probably alludes to it. John does not report it, possibly because this gospel is a perpetual theophany, at least regarded. That's one commentator's on it. And I think, I am the light of the world, Jesus says. Why would the Synoptics report it and John not? Is Jesus saying, I am the light of the world, a sufficient stand-in for this story? Well, I think one way to summarize this story faithfully would be Jesus saying, I am the light of the world. But right away, John doesn't have it. The Synoptics do. Listening to Tom Holland in his podcast about Arthur, what we want to really know was, did it really happen? And just seeing on Twitter, Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson are going to have a conversation, and the virgin birth came up, and did it really happen? And again, people listen to Jonathan Pageau and think, I don't know what he means. He sounds like a modernist because we expect the fundamentalists and the literalists, as we call them, to say, yes, it really happened. And why are we concerned about that? And even me just saying it that way leads a whole bunch of you to think I'm a modernist. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm trying to focus on stuff on our side of the line here. Why we can't read this text like they used to. And I haven't gotten to that point yet. And I am in a minute. I'm going to make that case. And it has everything to do with the other Pageau's book, because that's what the point of the book is. The non-canonical Apocalypse of Peter had a passage descriptive of paradise that some thought echoes the synoptic accounts. There are hints of the Transfiguration story in the Acts of John, the Acts of Peter, and the Acts of Thomas, although the Gospel of Thomas makes no reference to any kind of it. A later Gnostic document known as Pistis Sophia contains a bizarre reworking of the story, apparently a fusion of New Testament Transfiguration and Ascension accounts. Now, again, that's from a Gnostic Gospel or a Gnostic document, but that gives us an indication about how this passage was, what this passage assumed to mean. And to pair it with a transfiguration and the ascension makes sense, and it makes a whole lot of sense in a Gnostic interpretation. Now, this was in ISBE, and I found this fascinating. Well, actually, I'm going to pull it up. The Transfiguration belongs to the most difficult gospel materials, which include the accounts of Jesus' baptism and temptation. Why would these be difficult for us? Because this is a 20th century scholar calling these the most difficult. If they were the most difficult, wouldn't they always have been difficult? What makes them difficult now and they weren't difficult for most of the church's reading of it? All three incidents involve the person of our Lord in a way that provides a unique glimpse into the cosmic proportions of his life and work. And it is largely this extra dimension that complicates the task of interpretation. Oh, wouldn't it be complicated for everyone? Wouldn't we be paying a lot of attention in terms of the people who are attempting to convey the meaning of this in other words to their contemporary audience? Now pay attention what comes next. Neither the Apostolic Fathers nor the second century apologists in their available works ever refer to the Transfiguration. Why? Probably because they didn't need to explain it. Probably because their audience completely understood what this meant. They didn't need to do, as Matthieu Pageau does, making YouTube videos explaining symbolism, putting symbolism into prose or even prosaic language, because we don't understand the language of symbolism at all. They didn't explain it because it was obvious. It wasn't that they denied the historicity. That's a whole nother level of conversation, something that we are going to keep bumping into. It's just that when they read it, they got it. It was clear. So very early on, didn't come up. It was just obvious what this meant, what this said, who Jesus was. The event is first mentioned in Origen's Contra Celsus and commentary on Matthew. Tertullian referred to it, John of Damascus had a very profound homily on it, and Chrysostom treated the lection in this regular textual expositions. All of these interpretations, however, are little more than comments on the text. They didn't need to explain it. They didn't need to figure it out. It wasn't the most difficult gospel materials. It was the most obvious gospel materials. Why isn't it obvious to us? The problem isn't in the Bible. The problem is in the reader. The problem is in the distance between the readers and our worlds. Not until the beginning of the 19th century, were attempts made to explain the event comprehensively. And now we're going to have combinatorial explosion. 5 different views of it can be identified. 1, as an atmospheric phenomenon. As an atmospheric phenomenon? What are we trying to do in the 19th century on? We are very fixed on the question, what happened? Can we explain it according to natural processes that basically construct our world? 2, as a psychological experience, vision or dream, maybe a psychedelic, either of Jesus alone or of Jesus and his disciples. 3, a bit of, I'm not going to try and read that German word, church community theology. Oh, you Germans and your funny language, how you can take all of these concepts and squish them together in these ever-enlarging words. In English, we have to use 3 words to do what you can say in 1. Church community theology. It means this about the church community. 4, as a literary creation. Now we're into the interpretive, the new cutting edge interpretive tools that came towards the end of the 20th century, because basically a lot of the other tools had ground to a halt and made the text obscure and impossible to understand or relate to. Or 5, as an actual occurrence. Nobody questioned that, or what exactly was going on in terms of the assumptions. Why are we asking the questions we're asking? And this, in many ways, is the whole point of Pageau's book. Now, we're up to a heaven and earth cosmology. What was commonly assumed in the cultures basically made the story of the Transfiguration and Jesus just obvious. Explanations are sort of like reading in translation, only worse. You tried to see it from the outside, but it wasn't really formed in you from the inside and known deeply. It's like trying, I love the story of C.S. Lewis when he says, it's like trying to explain, it's like a little boy coming up to his parent and asking him to explain sex. And, well, when a daddy and mommy love each other and it's very pleasurable, and the child asks, will there be chocolate? Well, I suppose you could include chocolate, but the point is that there's something beyond the question asker, that the question asker, the little boy who hopefully is innocent and naive of sexual pleasure, something the little boy can't understand because it's outside of him. And a dad or mommy could say, yes, it feels very nice, but that's a very different thing from no longer being a virgin and having a satisfying sexual experience. Feels very nice is an explanation, but how do we communicate it? Well, we can do it through art. We can do it through sound. You can think of When Harry Met Sally. And we've got the full 4 P's of knowing, or however many, all the P's that we can think of. But this is what we're dealing with here. This text is far away from us. But now again, the modernist and the fundamentalist come to the text, and the modernist is going to use 1 through 4 of those explanations to try and account for the text. And the fundamentalists say it really happened. But that doesn't mean either of them necessarily know the text like someone from that culture would know the text. Now, this is dangerous stuff to talk about, because Protestants believe in the perspicuity of Scripture, and I'm not going to back away from that. But perspicuity does not mean we all fathom it completely. I think it basically means God can use it to get from it what he wants to give us. But that doesn't, of course, undermine the agency we need to have. And again, so many of these issues that we're bumping up into in modernity are like this. Our agency, divine agency, these are all past forks that we can't get through back to the other side. They're sort of like one-way canals. Now, there's lots of work being done on this. And again, John Walton's been trying to work on this in various ways. The Lost World of Genesis 1 is his most popular attempt to get at it. He wrote a little bit more middle-brow exegetical book, Genesis 1 as Ancient Cosmology, which you can find out there. C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image, and then I just noted in my Kindle library, I had downloaded a sample, and now I'm starting to read it, The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth by D.E. Harding. It's an interesting book in terms of a lot of this kind of thing, and C.S. Lewis wrote an introduction to it. So we've been dealing with this stuff for a long time, and we are in some ways distant from the text in a way that Matthieu Pageau's book is trying to get us back in touch with. And we have something like the problem. I was just a new YouTuber that Rick turned me on to. Whatever happened to our villains? We don't see what's happening in the movies. He says, well, why are all of our villains so bad? Why are the new Star Wars movies so uncompelling? And he goes into an explanation of it. And after he explains it, it's like, oh yeah, I can see what you mean, but that doesn't necessarily put you back into what was lost. And C.S. Lewis writes about this in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, and I've read that sermon a number of times, but that sermon directly relates to this. I turn next to the idea of glory. There's no getting away from the fact that this idea is very prominent in the New Testament and in early Christian writings. Salvation is constantly associated with palms, crowns, white robes, thrones, and splendor like the sun and the stars. Those are what inhabited that world, and it was one's experience in that world that associated palms. And I don't mean these palms, I mean palm branches, Hosanna, Palm Sunday, crowns, white robes, thrones, splendor. Now you can sort of get a sense of, okay, well, why do the liturgical churches go into statuary and vestments and liturgy. They are, in a sense, continuing to rehearse these things. But and now you could get a sense of why Protestants got to a point where, well, reformers were looking at all of the explanations of the stained glass and the statuary and the vestments and all of that. And the Protestants basically said, let's just explain it, because all of this stuff here in northern Germany, I don't think has much at all to do with what happened back there. And they had a point. So we're having trouble living into something that happened 2,000 years ago, half a world away. And this is part of the reason why Protestants, when they visit the Holy Land, have such a moving experience, because certain little things at least drip in and maybe, cruft it over in the kinds of ways that Protestant reformers complained about. But then you have a Protestant preacher explaining, it's a sermon, exactly connecting all of the stuff that they're touring in the Holy Land with stuff in the Bible. And then boom, click, oh, it moved me. This was wonderful. This was great. I now see with new eyes. But Lewis is saying, I read the text, because Lewis was a text guy. I read the text. He wound up taking a trip to Greece with his wife eventually, but it was a short trip because she wasn't well, and he loved it. But Lewis never traveled. He traveled everywhere through books. All of this makes no immediate appeal to me at all, Lewis confesses. And in that respect, I fancy I am a typical modern. Glory suggests two ideas to me, of which one seems wicked and the other ridiculous. And I think Lewis is a very honest reader here, and he's a very sensitive reader. He is reading the text and watching in himself and saying, they all seem to be speaking a language of palms and robes and crowns and thorns and splendor that I just don't get. And when I look at the elements, well, they seem wicked or ridiculous. Either glory means to me fame, or it means luminosity. As for the first, since to be famous means to be better known than other people, that violates his egalitarian stripe, which Lewis worked quite a bit on if you read his essays. The desire of fame appears to me to be a competitive passion, and therefore of hell rather than heaven. Hell and heaven. So two-world mythology, is it hell and heaven? Or is it heaven and earth? Which two worlds are we talking about, and what do those two worlds mean? As for the second, who wishes to become a kind of a living electric light bulb? And I used this text in last year's Transfiguration sermon, because unless we understand how we're misreading the text, it's very difficult to read the text better. And so, shine, Jesus, shine. Well, we'll have to pick that song for this Sunday. Jesus is shining, so what? Let there be light. Now, it's, again, in terms of the lived experiences. Now I sound postmodern, right? In terms of the lived experiences, if you're in the ancient world, what are light sources? Well, let there be light. There's light from the luminaries, the functionaries, as John Walton calls them above. There's the sun to light the day and the moon to light the night, and the stars, they don't give up too much light. But then there's fire, and it can come in a bonfire or a fire in a fireplace or in a lamp, but it's fire, or it's lightning, which was often sort of fire, because how are they supposed to think of lightning as electricity? No, they don't have any concept of electricity, but when lightning strikes the earth, what happens? It's fire. So lightning is fire for them. Earthly lights are also pressed into service if you look at this. So Jesus shining, what does that mean? Jesus is brilliant like lightning. Well, you have the burning bush. Well, that's, symbolic of God's presence. You have God describes himself as a consuming fire. And there's the lampstand in the tabernacle and the temple that gives light. And there's the fire on the altar. And you have the strange occurrences in the book of Leviticus when the sons of Aaron try to introduce strange fire and they're struck down by God. And you have the pillar of fire at night. And so, the relationship between fire and God is a very close one in their symbolic imaginary. But again, for a modern like C.S. Lewis, Jesus is shining. Well, makes me think of Galadriel. But, the movie makers are quite, is she dark? Is she light? Shining, Jonathan Pageau makes the point quite rightly, we YouTubers are beings of light to you. Where, stuff is going on psychologically. We're moderns. Now we'll get a little bit into part 2 of Pageau's The Language of Creation, Heaven and Earth in Biblical Cosmology. And again, there's part of the reason that I paused on this is that I was reading this, I was reading Walton, I was reading Lewis, I was reading some other sources, and this gets really complex really fast. Now I jump to the chapter 10 of Light and Darkness, a spiritual perspective. I don't like the word, but I don't have a better one, so I'm stuck. The example below should suffice to illustrate the roles of light and darkness from this perspective. It shows a dichotomy of two concrete objects, blade and stairway, between which of them there is no discernible relationship. Thus, pairing these objects together produces a dark enigma, and I think that's exactly a dark enigma. See, part of what's challenging about this book, again, it's sort of like learning a new language, and so many of you tried to learn a language in high school Spanish or French class, and you failed miserably. The other way to learn a language is to move to a country where that language is spoken, preferably before the age of 25, and be immersed in it, and you'd be amazed at what you learn. And then suddenly you start dreaming in my case, Spanish. You stop translating in your head and you start living in the language because the language is all around you. And in C.S. Lewis terms, it's about crowns and palms and triumphs and crucifixions and all of the things of the Roman Empire that for us are just sort of trapped in pages. All right. So the relationship between blade and stairway is a dark enigma. I think that's a great way to say it. That could potentially support an invisible principle. We can't see it. It's dark, which currently remains unknown. In traditional cosmology, material reality is considered obscure or dark when disconnected from heavenly principle. That's why there's no meaning. It's dark. It just is. And this shines light onto the questions. Well, did it happen? And an ancient would look at that and say, you're not going to get what you need to from that question because it's dark, because you're asking about the physicality. And this is something that I'm going to have to get into again and again and again and again. But it's for this reason that people listen to Jonathan Pageau and interpret him as a modernist, which again is laughable the more you hear from Jonathan Pageau, and which again led to the crying game moment with Rationality Rules. In traditional cosmology, material reality is considered obscure or dark when disconnected from a heavenly principle. And that principle word, again, if you say that in front of a bunch of evangelicals, they're going to hear it a different way because of the modernist fundamentalist split. Heavenly is probably the better word, but we don't know what heavenly means. We're trying to define heavenly by using the word. Conversely, the principle itself is seen as the invisible source of light that implicitly contains the answer to the enigma. Now we're getting a sense of what the Transfiguration means. and Lewis had this. It's not that, it's because I see the world by it. That's what Lewis is talking about here. When these components are finally brought together, the light becomes explicit to reveal a unifying truth. See the answer in the following page, and we will. But now, think about it this way. This room that I'm sitting in is full of light. I have all these electric lights on. In fact, I have one special light here because, eventually I learned how to properly light myself. Can do a lot for your video image on YouTube. Yada, 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 yada. Now, if I look at that, I say, there's a light. But if I don't look at the light sources, I don't actually see the light. But I see everything by the light. Okay? So where is the light? Let there be light. And for a long time, again, moderns, well, ancients too, would read that and say, let there be light. And he called the light day. But the sun and the moon don't come until later. Then what are the sun and the moon? Well, are you saying the sun and the moon aren't there? No. I'm saying that light and heaven and all of these words mean something slightly different than what we assume them to mean by virtue of the fact that we've been living in this dramatic, liturgical, cultural environment. And that's the point of this book. In this same manner, corporeal reality acts as a question with the power to host spiritual meaning when properly answered. In other words, it's all occasion. All of this physicality is occasion for something to point through to something else. Now, that can get very Platonic, but it's not merely Platonic. Therefore, even though matter is inherently dark, as in meaningless, it is also considered a cause of revelation and manifestation. I don't know if it's a cause as much as it's an occasion of revelation and manifestation. Why? Because you need the light for the revelation. It is also considered a cause of, indeed, without the contribution of material reality, certain spiritual principles, would be too abstract and simple to understand. And if you look at the layout of part 2, the difficulty of understanding his points in chapters 5, 6, and 7 are because you need chapters 9 through 13. You need the physical manifestations, the physical occasions to understand the point he is trying to make. Now we turn the page in the book. This concept of knowledge may still be counterintuitive to the reader. It takes a little while to learn a new language, because you sort of have to live into a new reality. Pablo in the Dominican Republic was a little bit different person from Paul in the United States. And you talk to missionaries and people who are bicultural to a significant degree, and they'll tell you that. But you've experienced it if you've grown up and then you went back to your parents' home and slept in your old bedroom and probably started behaving something like that 12-year-old who left. We're like that. This concept of knowledge may still be counterintuitive to the reader because we usually say that something is too complicated when we fail to understand it. We often implying that light would be needed. We need to have it illuminated. That light would be needed to clarify, to make clear the matter. The matter. The matter. However, we rarely think about the flip side of the cognitive process, that an idea can also be too abstract to grasp and may require detailed examples to appreciate its ramifications. And preachers and teachers and explainers know this because, as I've said before, people will remember most of the abstract points in my sermons, but they will remember the applications and the illustrations. And this, for Pageau, gets into where heaven and earth meet. So you have an inclined plane, which now goes into the middle. So we have light from above, darkness from below, inform from above, express from below, and together they make knowledge in the middle. So wedge and ramp, blade and stairway, the light as an inclined plane now makes sense of the relationship between blade and stairway. In general, the archaic concepts of light and darkness have little to do with their current scientific definitions. Right. Because, as John Walton keeps saying about Genesis 1, we naturally explicitly go to the question of these material causes. And I think this gets into my resistance to sort of an implicit spiritual Cartesian substance, so that when God says, let there be light, what happens with fundamentalists is that they sort of sneak a material causation in because that's the only language they can understand. And if you push that too far, you wind up with creation science, because that's what the system requires. And Pageau is saying, well, we're all materialists unless you learn another language. And it's really hard to not be a materialist because that's what we're living in the middle of. And it's not just what secular humanism is telling us in the public schools. It's built into how we talk about history. It's built into how we think. And, of course, this is where the Pageau brothers have been working to try to, maybe now that modernity is waning, people are ready to learn a little something else. In general, archaic conceptions of light and darkness have little to do with their current scientific definitions. They are synonymous with the revelation of a spiritual principle. As it descends, I think spirit as it descends, but a principle. Now we've sort of, again, given it sort of this weird post-Cartesian spiritual substance, and I think it's more energy in terms of our imaginary. As it descends into the obscurity of corporeal reality to illuminate its mysteries. And this is where you get into, again, I've been reading this stuff for a long time, this mysterion, which you bump into in the New Testament. And we always, for us, the word mystery is punting. Oh, it's too complicated. We don't understand it. In New Testament terminology, mysterion is more like a secret which will be revealed. And that's the language that's used about when Jesus comes as the light, he reveals the interpretive key for all of the dark material unto that point. That's how it functions in the New Testament. And that's light. Now, I want to pull in a little bit more John Walton, because what's key if you read Walton is the functionality of this, and this gets into a bunch of things that I've been working on in my previous videos about the gods. Well, what are the gods? This is from his book, Ancient Near East Thought in the Old Testament, introducing the conceptual world of the Hebrew Bible. So in some ways, this book is a much less user-friendly attempt at exactly what Matthieu Pageau's book is attempting to do, but he's sort of couched in much more academic language. And I'm not sure they're kind of coming to the same point, but it's a very interesting parallel. This chapter introduces the divine world in general, including how deities functioned among themselves as cosmic overseers and how they interacted with human beings. There is no such word as religion in the languages of the ancient Near East. Where have we heard this before, Tom Holland? Likewise, there is no dichotomy between sacred and secular, or even between natural and supernatural. These are all these forks that have occurred since then. The only suitable dichotomy is between spiritual and physical. Though even that would be a less meaningful distinction to them than it is to us. Again, we're back to some ancient Barfieldian unions like spirit and wind, because wind is the physical manifestation of spirit. And it's almost pure, and light is right there in that midst. Let there be light. No, but I see a lamp. No, you don't see light. You use light to see. Inside, outside. In the end, there is a distinction between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm, but events in the two are often intertwined or parallel. And this is where Pageau's work gets very hard, because there's actually, Pageau is trying to simplify it for us when he, did I put that diagram in? No. Pageau is trying to simplify it for us, but it's more complex than that, and you keep bumping into it because we like, via materiality, a lot of hard surfaces. And that's so much the way we interact. And so, yes, there's the two worlds mythology, but they're not just up and down. They're intertwined and parallel, and they're constantly all mixed. And I think Pageau says that, but his diagrams have to be simple to first try to conceptualize it. Roberto es un chico. That's one of the first sentences you learned, and I learned in high school. I don't know if they're going to teach that anymore in high school Spanish. Robert is a boy. Robert is a boy. Sara es una chica. Sarah is a girl. In the end, there is a distinction between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm, but events in the two are often intertwined or parallel. It would be difficult to discuss with ancients the conception of divine intervention. All the Calvinist Arminian fights about agency, about divine election, double predestination, they didn't have that problem. We have all these splits since then. And the Bible, at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph telling his brothers, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Well, who did it? You or God? What a silly question. No, answer the question. You're talking about a fork that didn't exist, but I'm on this side of the fork. I don't know what to tell you. I can't explain it to you. I'm trying. It would be difficult to discuss with the ancients the conception of divine intervention, because in their worldview, deity was too integrated into the cosmos to intervene in it. It's not God actions or my actions. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity a little bit, but Lewis, I don't think, Lewis deals with this in a few different places, but all of these dichotomies, these happen in forks after the text, and we have to deal with those forks. We made them. We have to deal with them. For the most part, deity is on the inside, not the outside. All experience was religious experience. Remember, they didn't have religion. It's all religion. All experience was religious experience. All law was spiritual in nature. Now, what on earth does Walton mean by law there? Maybe I should have John Walton on the channel. I don't know. I don't, part of the reason I don't ask a lot of experts on is because I don't think a half hour or 45 minutes will get us much of anywhere. And all it does is sort of, I'm going to get an expert on, and so I'll get more viewers. And I'm always really ambivalent about whether I want more viewers. Some days I do, and some days I don't. All experience is religious experience. All law was spiritual in nature. All duties were duties to the gods. All events had deity as their cause. Life was religion, and religion could not be compartmentalized within life. Now let's get into ontology and theogony, and that gets into a bit of this book. The mythology of both Mesopotamia and Egypt makes clear that the gods had origins. Not in the Bible. They exist in familial relationships, and they are generations of gods. And there are generations of gods. When the texts speak of theogony, origins of the gods, they include a number of elements in the presentation. In Egyptian literature, it is most common to think of earliest gods going into being through bodily fluids, the creator god spitting, sneezing, sweating, or masturbating, while the latter deities were simply born to a previous generation of deity. In the Memphite theology, the gods are brought into being by Atum, separating themselves from himself. And you can read similar things in the Greeks. One way that the creation was expressed was by the mouth which pronounces the name of everything. Words. Words, Roxanne, words. Worms, Roxanne, worms. 80s movie reference for you there. That one's for free. Typically, the first gods created are primordial cosmic gods, since the forces of nature are expressions and manifestations of attributes of deities. Pay attention. Cosmogony and theogony become intertwined as the natural world comes into being with gods who embody the various elements of the cosmos. You can see why heaven and earth, the gods, and reality are all together, because what are the gods? Now again, if Sam Harris says there are no gods, he's thinking Thor and Iron Man and Zeus. He's thinking a material being with superpowers. Or we have this weird Cartesian dualism where there's this spiritual substance that is separate from earthly substance, and maybe some of that we get from poorly reading 1 Corinthians 15. And why can't we find this spiritual substance? Well, because this spiritual substance is invisible. And that gets us reading Frank Peretti and This Present Darkness. But all of this is supposed to rewire our imagination with respect to these things. What does it mean to say that a god exists or comes into existence? I don't know. There's like thousands of YouTube debates about gods and existings, and hardly any of them ask this question that John Walton asks here. What does it mean to say that a god exists or comes into existence? The question of ontology, what it means for something to exist, is important for understanding both theogony and cosmogony, which is basically the origin of the gods and the origin of the cosmos. Because we cannot productively talk about how something came into existence until we define in some way what it means to exist. What is real? We're back to that question. Is Santa Claus real? Real enough to have mom put all the kids in the car and drive them down to the mall. Real enough to have a bunch of men my age with not much hair up here and a real ample ability to grow it down here to get like part-time jobs in the winter months, having kids sit on our lap. That's pretty real. Are spirits real? Is school spirit real? You put up posters to it. Boys and girls put on uniforms and do flips or carry footballs for it. School bands play instruments for it. Is it real? Is the sacredness of the Capitol real? Is on and on and on and on and on we go. What is spiritual? In the ancient world, something came into existence when it was separated out. Ooh, now we're finding the forks. When it was separated out as a distinct entity, given a function and given a name. I'm going to read that again because it's really important. In the ancient world, something came into existence when it was separated out as a distinct entity, It was something different from something else. It was given a function. It did something in the world, and it was given a name. It became logic. Logic. If I say it that way, it doesn't sound like logic, does it? But it's logic. Now, suddenly, it comes into existence. So the ritual of Amun from the second half of the second millennium identifies creation as beginning when no God had come into being and no name had been invented for anything. The first God arises on his own from the primeval waters, separated himself from them, and then separated into millions. And on it goes from there. And you can find this in John Walton's Ancient Near East Thought and the Old Testament, introducing the conceptual world of the Hebrew Bible. Pretty much the same thing as Pageau's The Language of Creation. This leads us to a whole bunch of things I've been thinking about. Think about Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. Think about all of these paintings that we have here. Here you have, well, Constantine and the battle, and you see the shields and the horses and the the crosses up on standards, but then there's people floating up in the air above it. Are they really there? Is putting things on a standard bringing the angels down to give Constantine the victory over his enemies? Why do paintings keep putting those things in there? And in my video, just a little video on how purity movements are challenged institutions to the right and to the left, I noted that when we talk about history, well, I thought we had a problem between the Bible and science. No, we actually have a real issue. Our real issue is between the Bible and history, because we don't know what we're doing. Because, well, read George Marsden's book, excellent book. George Marsden explains the historical processes that have led to the shape of our religion now. We might imagine that's a spiritual process. If we were to draw a painting of the change in Christian nationalism from 1870 to 2021, we could put spirits in the sky. We might tell a story like Frank Peretti in This Present Darkness. I should probably read some of that for you, because some of you know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Frank Peretti, and others of you don't. Or we could look at Touched by an Angel and think about, or Highway to Heaven. Think about those sappy movies in the 80s of angels in our midst, and why we lapped that stuff up, or why certain kinds of evangelicals lapped that stuff up. What is going on with us? What is spirit? What is spiritual? What do these words mean? And why do we have men floating with swords above Constantine's battle, giving him the victory? And why, when Elisha looks up and his servant looks up, when his eyes are open to the light, do they see the chariots and the armies of God surrounding the armies of Syria? What are those stories about? Oh, I just don't believe that there's really. We all seem to believe in historical processes, yielding things like fascism and communism and democracy and wokeism and fundamentalism and all of these things. We all believe in those, but we don't. Well, is that spiritual? Well, is such a thing as school spirit? That's what the Pageau book is trying to get at, and that's what Walton's book is trying to get at. But as a preacher, well, this is obviously pretty important stuff, because we sit there and we tell our congregations that, well, you're spiritual creatures. And even people who won't go to church want to be spiritual but not religious. And what on earth do they mean by that? So, yeah, we've got something to talk about. I was watching The Bachelor with my wife and daughters the other night. It's one of our weekend shows where 32 drop-dead gorgeous women try for the affection of one drop-dead gorgeous man. And, well, the creators of the show certainly bank on drama, breaking out in the house. What is... How, you all understood exactly what I meant when I said that sentence. Drama breaking out in the house. How am I using language? Is drama spiritual? And because there was drama, and because these women are competing, and because, well, what happens if you watch The Bachelorette? What do the men do? The men, they're going to be pushing and shoving and talking, and, they're going to be vying for that beautiful young maiden. The men are going to be pushing each other. There's going to be blood. There's not going to be any blood here. There's going to be plenty of reputational savagery. And there is. And then suddenly, the house is toxic. Oh, they seem to be taping this in a 5-star resort someplace, and the place looks beautiful. Is there black mold? No, there's no black mold. But the house is toxic. Is that toxicity spiritual? Oh, you bet it is. Does it have to do with morality? Oh, you bet it does. What word did we use before we used the word toxic? If you look at history and English words, he gets into the word electric. Was lightning electricity? Well, we had to wait for Ben Franklin to figure that out. It was fire. It was divinity. It was heaven. It was a god, or gods through it. Zeus and his lightning bolts, right? Why did toxic become such a spiritual word? It used to be a scientific word, didn't it? Toxemia, toxicity, poison. Someone, I think a little earlier, might have said, well, the house is poisonous. Well, they wouldn't have said it that way, but now suddenly we have this word toxic, and it's oh so useful. And you'll hear it in church all the time now. It's a very spiritual word. Well, if we were to try to symbolize... Very noisy street. If we were to try to symbolize toxicity, might it look like a demon? Might it look like someone in dark figures going about the house, putting poison on the tongues for women to spew onto their rivals and adversaries? Is a house being toxic arenic? Well, the arena feels toxic. Is it agentic? Well, the toxicity seems to be taking these women out of the game. And so finally, some of the women came and said, the house is toxic and we mustn't have toxic. We're very concerned about toxic these days. And so the man, nobody complained about the man taking charge there. The man is about to take charge because it's his job to protect these women, and he's not going to let the house become toxic, even though the producers have been banking on this and set it up so it would surely be toxic. That's the point of the show. So he goes in and let's find who is introducing the toxicity. And we don't find some beautiful woman in an evening gown with a chemistry set whipping up batches and pouring things in drinks. Is it spiritual warfare? Yeah. This is what we're in the midst of. This is what we're doing. And we're trying to figure this out. And so we're kind of in word salad land. And not until the 19th century did we have to begin to explain why Jesus is glowing like a light bulb, because they didn't have electricity. And fire and lamps, well, it was sort of divine, wasn't it? And that's the world that we lived in. The image has been discarded. And now we struggle how to understand the text. And now I have to sit down and make my slides for Sunday. And I think I've got more ideas, but This was not a rough draft for Sunday. This is the pre-rough draft. And I'm going to post it on the internet now, and maybe in the comment section I'll get more wisdom that will help me on my Sunday sermon. So thanks for playing along.